Tamam, teşekkür ederim. Evet, dışarıda şeyimiz mevcut, kulaklıklarımız. Dolayısıyla bunları temin edebilirsiniz. So I just informed the crowd that the session will be in English because all my guests are foreigners outside Turkey. And thank you for traveling all the way to be here with us today because we are also very happy that Turkey is speeding up the commitment for offshore wind capacities as it is announced by the Minister of Energy yesterday. And this session has now more meaning. It's more meaningful right now because of that also announcement yesterday. If you can present my presentation, sunumumu yansıtabilirseniz. I will try to just set the floor with what has happened to Turkey up to now and also the contribution of TÜREB as well on this. And then I will direct my first question to Anna Marie. And after, before starting with the answers, I would also kindly ask you to introduce yourself briefly, so our audience knows who you are and which company you are representing. So the history of offshore wind in Turkey is not really short. We've started this journey in 2018 with the first unsuccessful offshore wind tender. But then Ministry of Energy has understood that there has to be more preparations to conduct a successful tender for offshore wind. It's not like onshore or solar photovoltaic. And since the offshore wind is also included in our national energy plan, which is actually printed in 2022, TÜREB, as the Turkish Wind Energy Association, we've also started focusing on helping our governmental institutions on this journey. And it has started with the master plan to have a site selection campaign. We have, as you can see on the screen, that's just a summary, but we have determined 20 sites that can take up to 900 turbine locations. And we have ranked them with respect to their feasibility, like low LCOE, and also the permitting. And after that, we have realized and also presented to the ministry that the most favorable sites are in the northern Aegean Sea. Please move to the next slide, please. Okay. Where is it? I don't have it. Okay, thank you. And then these are the 4 sites. Actually, Minister has mentioned about Gökçeada, which was an update in the last few weeks because the permitting at TWEA site was not done. It was not successful, to be honest. Then they have included another area in the Gökçeada. And these are the 4 sites that was under investigation. And hopefully, this year we will receive one of these sites as a candidate for the upcoming tender. On top of that, there is also a tender mechanism designed. We, as the association, we were also invited in those discussions as well. And that was already shared by the Ahmet Özkaya, who is the manager of the Energy Affairs, General Manager of the Energy Affairs. And he has already presented this to the investors, financing institutions, even the supply chain. So industry is aware of the details of the mechanism, what is coming up. I'm not going to go into details. It's not my role to deliver that before the ministry announces officially. But it is obvious. So this, and on the screen you see our goal for 2035, 48 gigawatts, and the capacities installed, like almost 15 gigawatts. And what is the second one, 3.4 gigawatt, is under construction, and 20 gigawatt is a pipeline. But even with the onshore YEKA commitment that you see, 1 gigawatt per year, YEKA onshore, we are still short because we will not be able to realize all the pipeline. There is always some casualties that you can lose, some projects that is due to feasibility or other problems, permitting. So this figure shows that Turkey needs offshore wind if we want to achieve 48 gigawatts until 2035. So this is how I want to set the stage. for my guests. And also Anna-Marie, she has traveled from Denmark for us. Thank you very much. But due to the flight conflicts or schedules, she has to leave a bit earlier, so she will not be here with us till the end. That's why I'm sorry, but I have to ask first two questions to Anna. Only woman. Yes. So, and the first question, Anna, I'm sure you are already aware also the details of the tender mechanism that has been going around, prepared by the Ministry of Energy. Do you think, from the export credit and project finance perspective, your perspective, is this model realistic? What do you think about this model? And also maybe there are a lot of developers, IPPs here in this room for sure, and in Turkey we are familiar with financing institutions to cover the DEVEX as well, development expenditures. Do you think with this model, EIFO or another institution can pay for the DEVEX as well?
Yes, well, thank you very much for the question. I'll start by introducing myself a little. My name is Anne-Marie OWIE. I've worked for the institution called EIFO now. We used to be called EKF, and we are the Danish Export Credit Agency. We have by now financed roughly 45 gigawatts of wind globally, hereof 24 gigawatts offshore wind, primarily in the northern part of Europe, of course, which is the cradle of offshore wind. But we have also played quite a big role in the development of the Taiwanese offshore market. And as our dear keynote speaker said, the Dutch are very good at the supply chain, but so are the Danish. And we are definitely back in the market and willing to do a lot of business here in Turkey as well to help you to build out your pipeline. So coming back to your question, I think it's important to say that the way that we would normally structure a financing or look at a project would be that export credit agencies, we come in when there is actually a project that is fully developed and ready to finance. At that time, we will be looking at the total capex of the project, and then we will be looking at who is it, how is the risk sharing between the developer and maybe incoming investors, and the banks and other institutions doing the senior debt in the financing. And at that time, we would be looking at the total DEVEX, which also, CAPEX, which also, of course, include the DEVEX costs. But it's not a thing that we would not be isolated, go in at the state of the DEVEX and finance that. I think there are other institutions that are better equipped for that, or including some commercial banks who see a role for themselves, playing in not only having already existing relations to the developers and to the sponsors, and then being interested in securing themselves a place in the long-term financing of the projects. For me, I think it's important to stress that we are, of course, very happy to include it in the overall CAPEX, and therefore also take our part in financing it on the long terms. And here we are looking at financing construction plus up to 22 years for these. But of course, it all depends on how the overall model looks, the financial model on these projects looks.
Thank you very much. And then second question. So in the 5 years ago or even 4 years ago, until these political turbulence that offshore wind is experiencing, and we've been seeing a lot of incentivized financing for offshore wind because it was considered as one of the most important tools to fight against the climate change. And how is the situation on the supply and demand side for the financing? We know for the OEMs, the demand is a bit lower, and then it is getting into a little bit of equilibrium maybe. But what is the situation in financing? Do we still have those favorable financing conditions for offshore wind?
Yeah, the basic answer there would be yes. I think actually offshore wind is considered a commodity, or not really a commodity, but you know, it's much more a mature industry. So at least in the developed market where you have experience already from financing a number of projects, you will see some kind of standardization. But when you move that financing or the whole supply chain into a new market, then you have to find new equilibrium there. So there's plenty of capital who wants to deploy into long-term financing of these solid, stable, renewable assets. It's just a matter of how do you actually, how do you set the standards? So we have one standard in the North Sea for the projects in the UK and the Netherlands and so other countries there where you say, well, these are sort of the terms because we know the regulatory setups there, we know, we have a pretty good idea of how the wind is going to actually blow in that area, and we've seen a lot of projects succeed, and therefore it's easier for us as institutions, but also for banks to sort of say, well, this is the capacity that we have. But it's also easier for the investors to look at that and say, okay, so we know that the banks are going to be there, they are willing to provide the long-term financing, and therefore we as investors can go in also and take part in not only small amounts, but there is actually also appetite to buy into these projects. And my wish for the Turkish markets is really that we could find that when you develop the markets here, that you come up with the first tender rounds successfully, that you will team up with international players on the investment side to make it more attractive and to fast-track the whole due diligence process and whole maturing of the market. I don't know if that made sense to everybody, but I'm trying to cover a lot of ground in a short time.
Yes, okay, thank you very much. If you have anything to add as a final word before you leave.
No, I think I'm just going to say that, we are here, and we would be very happy to speak to anyone who about any projects that might come up. We have the experience from the 24 gigawatts of offshore wind we've already financed. Actually, it's 40% nearly of all the operating capacity in the world that we have participated in the financing of. So for me, this just shows that we have the experience, and we have the capacity, and we have the willingness to go into new markets and to help to mature these markets. And we have the, simply we also have the supply chain. So for us, this is an extremely important market, the Turkish market here. We are really hopeful that that the timeline that the minister has set up will hold. But of course, there can be challenges, and the worst thing that could happen is that the upcoming auction here is unsuccessful because the terms will be too, too aggressive, because that will delay the whole process. So please consider that when in the upcoming process. But we're here, and we are looking for opportunities.
Thank you very much, Anna, for joining us, and have a safe trip back home. So, we will proceed then with my next guest, Bart. Bart is not new here because maybe some of you remember he was also one of our panelists last year at TÜREB. And last year it was in September, so not much time has passed since. And I have a very difficult question for him. We've been discussing this also last year. But this year I told him, like, Turkish market expects some facts and numbers to put in that explanation. And the biggest question, I haven't mentioned the projects that has been developed in the Marmara Sea. Although today I have showed you, and also our minister announced that the next tender, the sites are located in the northern Aegean Sea. But still, we have an ongoing measurement campaign, which is almost done, for a 1 gigawatt site in the Marmara Sea. And let's imagine in a scenario where we also want to do wind farms there in those sites, install wind farms there on those sites. The question is, these jack-up vessels, that huge vessels that installs like 252-meter diameter turbines and 170-meter tall towers, and also maybe for Turkish sites, it's at some locations 50-meter long, tall foundations, monopiles. How are we gonna pass the Çanakkale Bridge? Because those ships are not in the Black Sea or Marmara Sea. How are you planning to, if you have such a request, how are you gonna bring it? And how much will it cost for an investor?
Thank you, Ufuk, for the invitation once again. Always appreciate it. I have a feeling that you gave me the most difficult question of the panel today, but I don't know if the presentation can come on, because I have prepared some slides. And while we are at it, no better forum just to have a very quick introduction of our company, just to give you an idea what we do and why the question has come to us. So we at Jan de Nul, we are what we call ourselves world builders. We are involved in several offshore energy projects, and we do that both on water, land and energy. We have 4 different departments within Jan de Nul, of which offshore energy is one of the biggest, and is the reason why I'm also sitting here. But we also have dredging solution department, construction projects, mainly in Belgium, and planetary development with this revitalization of polluted soil. Now, we have about 9,000 people that work for our company, so that gives you an idea of the size, together with our turnover of about 4 billion, and that we are mainly focused on being a financial strong partner and safety leaders. But last and not least, we of course have also the fact that we are running on engineering power. And with that engineering power, I want to come a little bit to your question, because the Marmara Sea challenges are going to be extremely hard to see when you are confronted with having the need for installation vessels going to that area. And if you take just the main facts of the Çanakkale Bridge, and I tried to pronounce it and I tried to rehearse, but you did it better than I did. So is the access from the Mediterranean Sea to the Marmara Sea. And the facts are 70-meter air draft is the possibility for the bridge, with no restrictions up to 66 meters. So everything from 66 to 70 meters is a requirement to have escorted by tugboats, and I can already tell you it's not the biggest cost, but once you start working with restrictions and having additional vessels being involved, the price will go up. Now, the most commercial vessels in the normal commercial fleet have no problems to pass there, but main problems exist for the heavy lift vessels, the crane vessels, drilling vessels, checkup vessels, and cable lay vessels. I have divided the challenge into 3 different types of vessels, and I'm going to focus on the ones that are required for the installation of the foundations and the WTGs. And on the floating installation vessel side, which are vessels which are used to install the foundations mainly, you can see here a picture of one of our biggest vessels, which is going to be used for the most heavy components that are currently on the offshore wind market. And you can see this is a relevantly big vessel. We are capable of lowering the A-frame, and I don't know if I have a laser on this thing. No, but the A-frame is the yellow part at the end of the crane, which normally stands up. But in this type of vessel, we can lower it, which means that we can go under all the major bridges in the Bosporus and Suez Canal and Øresund Bridge, which I'm going to give as an example later. So I have a movie. They don't have to play it right now. I'll play it afterwards, maybe when everybody has done. But you can see that we have passed with this vessel under the Øresund Bridge in Denmark. which shows you that the draft that we had under it was only 6 to 8 meters, but you will see in the vicinity of such a big vessel that shows like be really, really small. But it is possible, so for the foundation side there is limited challenges. The A-frame you can see is here lowered, so that will make us being able to pass the Çanakkale Bridge. For the offshore jack-up vessels, it's a different story. You know that these vessels are made to jack themselves up out of the water, but that means that they have very long legs. The old generation jack-up vessel, or the previous generation, you can see that we are talking about 90 meters of leg length. 90 meters of leg length means that 70 meters of the Çanakkale Bridge is already too little. So what are the options? We can lower the legs while we are transiting to pass the bridge, but if you see around the Çanakkale Bridge channels, you see that the water depth there is relatively challenging, so we should be lowering our legs about 15 to 20 meters to pass. Now, if you look at the water depth in the two vicinities and the two directions of the canal, only one part of the direction is capable of lowering the legs to that water depth. So if we would get into the Marmara Sea, that would mean that if our vessels pass, the whole marine traffic needs to be stopped for a certain amount of time, which will be, of course, challenging once again. When lowering the spots and getting into the draft, that is a viable option, so there is no showstopper, but you should know that these older generation of installation vessels are normally capable of installing turbines up to 9.5, maybe a little bit more, 12, 15 megawatt turbines. But if you would go higher, you need the next generation of vessels. And then we come to the new generation. And I have here a picture of our vessel Voltaire, but all the new generation of vessels are about the same size and maybe even bigger. But this gives you an idea for the people who don't know how big we are talking about. This is a vessel which can reach with the top of the crane, the top of the Eiffel Tower. This, I must be very honest, this is an old picture. The Eiffel Tower has a new antenna, which is 7 meters longer since last year. So I am actually lying a little bit in this picture, but I hope you understand that we cannot make these renders every single year. Now, what comes to the biggest point in this story is that the leg length of these vessels is about 130 meters. 130 meters, that means that we should lower the legs between 65 meters below water level, leaving us a 65 meter air draft, which is 5 meters under the limit of the Çanakkale Bridge. Looking at the details of the water depth, that means indeed, again, we are challenged with the passing through. However, and now is the biggest challenge, for this type of vessel, the A-frame that we will be able to lower with the foundation vessel, we cannot lower. So the A-frame sticks up over the 70 meter air draft, which means that we have a problem for these types of vessels. Now, we at Jan de Nul don't like problems, so we always try to think about solutions. Unfortunately, you might not like the solutions, but it gives you an idea why it will be challenging in the Marmara Sea. Basculating bridges, we know them in Europe quite good, but I think changing the Çanakkale Bridge into a basculating bridge at this point in time will be difficult, yet you asked for cost. It is possible, but it will be expensive. The second part for the foundations, like I said, the foundation installation will not be a problem. There will be clearly a possibility to install them. But for the WTGs, I told you for the bigger ones there is a problem. So what are the options? We can remove the bridge. That is not an option, I think. We can remove our A-frame, which is very expensive. It will take 2 to 3 months to do it, and it will be a very, very expensive exercise. Or we stick to smaller WTGs, so that the older generation vessels can do that, but maybe that is killing the business case. And I don't know whether that will be. I think in these day and ages it will be killing the business case. I was talking to my colleague who will be coming on the microphone later. He had another solution, and that is maybe we can drain the Marmara Sea. But also there, I did not want to go very further into. And I'm also being challenged, but I'm not a specialist. We are talking about vessels, we are talking about components, but there are other components that need to be considered. Offshore substations, other parts in offshore wind that need to be transported. Will they be passing under the Chanakala Bridge? I don't know, and I did not really get into it. But those are the challenges that we see. We do think there are solutions, but if you really want the solutions to work, it will be a lot of money.
Thank you very much. So what I hear is the installation cost might be doubled. So
That is very positive, yes.
okay.
No, but there are solutions, and we will be thinking from now on, because now Turkey is indeed coming to the point that you are getting more tangible in offering these standards, and we will be thinking along with you to see how we can solve it. But the decision of going for the AGNC first is very much welcomed by us.
Yeah, okay. Good to know. So my next question, I will follow the order of the seating then, for Eric. So we, as Turkey, we also have like a habit to localize the technologies. We like to learn, look, watch first, understand, and try to produce it afterwards locally. And we always explain this as a success story for onshore wind as well. So 15 years ago, there were no factories in Turkey, but now we have tower factories, we have we had blade factories, and now the new ones are being built. We are also producing generators, so it's a success story for onshore. And the whole industry expects the same success story for offshore. But our ambition is for now is only 5 gigawatt. What do you think? Do you think this 5 gigawatt, 1 gigawatt for 5 consecutive years would be enough for having like a local supply chain triggered?
Smulders has been at the forefront of new developments in new countries entering their offshore wind era. And every time we are posed with the same question. How can localization contribute to the acceptance of offshore wind in the local community? And every time we have to give the same answer, which is that offshore wind, in our opinion, cannot thrive without local acceptance. So if an industry, offshore wind industry, sets foot on a new territory, it is absolutely necessary that local communities profit and that they participate in the construction and afterwards in the operation and maintenance. On the other side, where the technology stands today and the requirements of offshore energy infrastructure stands today, there has been a giant leap in technology from the first wind farm Smulders made in 2001 to our latest projects, Doggerbank or the Polish offshore wind farms. To give you an idea, if we look to the foundations only, the total weight of a transition piece nowadays is around 550 tons. Of that 550 tons, we have 80 tons of secondary steel. That is the stairs, the platforms, internal platform, access platforms, ladders, boat landings. You know, our first wind farm in Denmark, the total weight of the foundation there was 60 tons. total weight. And now it's 550 tons. Yeah? So, and with that goes the enormous investments you have to bring to the market in order to produce these foundations. Same goes for the substations. There has been an enormous complexity in the building, the design and the building of substations, which is now more a system integration than just, you know, you take an onshore substation and you put it on a jacket and that's it. Yeah? So, concluding, we have to, as an industry, we have to bring profit and we have to bring activities to the local communities bordering the offshore wind zone, but it takes an enormous investment. And therefore you need a pipeline, and a pipeline of 5 gigawatts is very small. Right? To give you an idea, Smulders, we can build 9 gigawatts of offshore energy infrastructure per year. So 5 gigawatts would mean, and I say that in all honesty and with humility, bring us only 6 months of work. And to do an investment of 800 million euros, because that's what you need for 6 months of work.
Okay, yes, thank you for honesty. That's what we need. Yeah, we need. Okay. I haven't had any good news so far, so this is not going well. Let's see, maybe Horatio will provide us some positive things to hear about. So Horatio, please, before you answer my question, start with introducing us, Mingyang. I'm sure like most of the audience is already familiar, but my question to you is about the feasibility and which is impacted by the price of the turbines severely. And in Turkey, we are aware that our wind conditions are not as favorable as the North Sea projects. To be honest, if you look at the energy generation only, yes, our sites might have less potential, but our sites have different advantages, like being near shore. So we don't have to travel with the ships for hours to get there for a maintenance, or maybe use a helicopter for it. Or we don't have to build like large transmission lines to carry the energy. So there are advantages, but I want to focus on the disadvantage with you. What Mingyang offers for low wind sites all around the world?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, Mr. Vice President Ufuk, and to let us speak today here. And first of all, I want to introduce Mingyang to you. So Mingyang is one of the world's biggest OEM companies from China, with a headquarter in China. We build up today over 150 gigawatt of offshore and onshore capacities. But as well, we are active in BESS and battery business internationally. And our strongest footprint is, of course, in Asia, is in China, and we are now started to build up our international business since 2-3 years, I would say. Our international headquarters is in Hamburg, in Germany, and we are very active in Europe at the moment. We moved our international R&D management into Europe, into the Hamburg headquarters, to develop our new products, our future products out of the European market, because we think the European market is the market at the moment. And I politely include here Turkey as well, because there's a very strong connection between Turkey and the European Union or Europe in developing the offshore market. So I'm very happy to talk today here. And I would say the good news is Mingyang has a wide portfolio of technology options in offshore. I think what I learned is that the innovation you do in producing turbines and in the volume of turbines and not in the lab. And before I joined Mingyang 8 months ago as CEO for the international business, I was heading as CEO the energy business for BASF, for a chemical company, and we invested into offshore wind parks as well, all around the world, in Europe, but as well in China. We founded a joint venture together with Mingyang at that time. We built an offshore wind park, and I must say the technology from Mingyang is very convincing. So coming back to your question, so can you compare the ecological environment in Turkey with, for example, the German or the European North Sea? Definitely not. Yeah, so that the wind speed is a little bit lower. But on the other hand, I think it depends on what kind of technology do you bring into the market. And I think here it is not only a view on the turbine, of course, but it is a view of the overall system around. And I think here I really appreciate your speech as well. I think the modern way of developing this kind of offshore projects is to thinking over the whole value chain and not only into one turbine. So here I'm convinced that Mingyang can offer you a great offer, because we have experience in not only offering the turbine technology, we bring in predictable maintenance. We have a deep geographical analysis before we propose a special turbine type, and we are sure we have the right offer in our basket for the Turkey market. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Horatio, and also thank you for being sponsor for this panel. So my last question for the first round is for Mark. I'm sure like half of this audience already knows him because he's involved in the Turkish market for, I think, how long? 7 years, maybe even longer? 10 years, okay, a decade. And yeah, so, and also you will introduce yourself for sure, but you heard the details, you saw the details of the tender mechanism that is coming up. And I want to get your opinion, your feedback on that. Do you think that mechanism will increase the appetite of the international developers and IPPs? If not, why?
Thanks, Ufuk, and thanks to TÜREB for having me. I'll introduce myself a little bit for those of you who don't know me. So my background is an engineer, so I particularly liked Bart's framing of a technical problem and coming up with options for how to solve that. And most of my career has been in working in new markets for offshore wind, and that always involves solving problems because we've got a big long list of unknowns and things to solve. I've been working with the World Bank for the last 6 years, but as I've said to Ufuk, I've been sort of supporting Turkey with offshore wind for the last 10 years. And it's been a journey, that's for sure. Perhaps before I answer some of your question, I'll take a little step back to give a bit of context as to where the market is right now. And we've talked a couple of times about the challenges that the market is facing. But in the 10 years that I've been working in Turkey for offshore wind, we've gone from a place of positivity, optimism. We started this industry 20, 30 years ago, been on a long technological journey, and did an amazing job of reducing costs, bringing down the cost of energy, giving the industry lots of confidence, giving policymakers a lot of confidence in the industry. And a lot of that has been driven by the increasing scale of the turbines and the technology, but also the cost of capital has come down. That's all changed, and the last few years has really shocked, I mean, the whole world, clearly global shocks, but offshore wind has been badly affected. It's a high capital requirement for the technology, long timelines of projects, very affected by cost of capital. That's affected, obviously, the cost of energy going up, stabilizing but going up, but also appetite for risk. And the appetite for the market in the last, 5, 6 years ago was high. Developers, investors were excited for new markets. They were looking at every opportunity possible. Even if it didn't quite make sense, they were still going to look at it and try and make it work. And there's been a big refocusing in the last few years back to the safe markets, the markets that they're comfortable in, the investors that have had a presence there, that they've seen it work, and trying to refocus back on those geographies. So that appetite for risk has disappeared, I'd say. And it takes a lot to bring that back and get investors interested in new markets again. I'd also say that there are a lot of market opportunities still around the world, and with this huge pipeline across Northern Europe, the traditional investors, utilities that have been involved in offshore wind have got a lot of opportunity across the North Sea where they're comfortable. So that's where we've seen everyone refocusing back to those markets. And as I said, trying to get them back interested in newer markets, even if the fundamentals are solid and there's good government commitment, it's difficult. And perhaps I could illustrate this with a couple of examples around the adjustments that markets are seeing in risk allocation. And we've seen governments starting on a position of, we want this from a tender, these are our objectives, and then the industry coming and saying, well, we need changes because that might have worked 5 years ago, but it's not where we're at now, and we want to see changes to that risk allocation to allow us to invest. Through that process, it really is about engaging with the market and consultation. And it's a journey of building the confidence with the industry about what you're trying to achieve. And it's difficult, it takes time. And I know that's possibly not what you want to hear about, the time that it does take, but it does take time to get this balance right to make sure that you've got parties to come and invest. So the couple of examples I would give, one is Colombia, which started its offshore wind journey 5 or 6 years ago at the time where the market was high. Everyone was looking for new markets, new opportunities. A lot of interest from developers in Colombia. They started their pre-qualification process in 2024 at the time where there was this reducing appetite for risk, and they saw immediately that there was a limited number of developers that were interested. They had to take a lot of feedback from the market. They reduced their qualification requirements to try and increase the number of bidders. They then went through a whole negotiation almost through these rounds of consultation with the market on the tender rules and on the general framework to reduce the risk to developers, to allow them to come in and try and get them to invest. And that included things like allowing a route to exiting the rights to the site if the risk was too high or the project was unviable. So that gives the comfort to the developers that they can invest something into the site, they can understand the site and the business case, but if it doesn't work, they can leave without penalty if they can prove that it doesn't work. And as part of that, they also had quite an innovative view on aligning developer, so private sector, and government targets, or milestones, let's say. So a developer, as it develops its project, is required to meet certain milestones and show that it's making progress. Normally, it's all on the developer. But in Colombia, where we've got the government still needing to do things around grid and ports and permitting, took a different view in saying, well, if we can align our requirements as a government with your requirements as an investor, does that make you more comfortable? And that was the sort of dialogue that we're having about getting that sort of more of a fair share of risk between government and a developer. And then similarly, we've seen very similar conversations in the Philippines. There was a bit longer of a development period because sites had already been allocated sort of 5 or 6 years ago. There is currently an auction underway now in the Philippines for a tariff. That first round of documents came out May last year, and there was probably a 6-month process of iterating with the developers around, again, those risk allocations within that tender. So that included easing of performance guarantees, really expanding the definition of force majeure. So if there are delays on the government side, that could allow a developer to have delays without penalty. Things like step-in rights, indexation, things that weren't there already in the framework that needed to be in place for developers. So, to your point, I think there needs to be this period of discussion. And I know that there's a framework at the moment for what that first tender could look like here, but it's going to take time to iterate around that and to look at all the different aspects of risk, from the offtake to the grid, permitting, ports. I think we'll come on to ports in a moment, and generally the supply chain, because there's a whole lot of uncertainty in Turkey on offshore wind, and there's lots that won't be answered before the tender starts. So what do we do with that risk and that uncertainty? How do we put that to a later stage, knowing that we're going to try and answer that later, but how do we make that comfortable for investors that are hoping that that will get sorted out in the future? I'd also say that offshore wind is very, very unlike onshore wind and solar, and we say this all the time, but it's more like large-scale hydro or nuclear. The scale is very different. The development expenditure you've got to put into a project before you even start building is $100 million plus. Now, to allow somebody to spend that amount of money, you've got to have that uncertainty pinned down, and you've got to have a lot of confidence for developers to spend that money. And it does take time, and it's not a quick journey. The World Bank has been supporting the government, as Ufuk was mentioning, in the Sea of Marmara, with funding to do some of that sort of early development work, gathering site data on wind conditions, but it's not just about wind, it's about the seabed conditions as well. They're looking at geophysical and geotechnical conditions, and generally the whole, the auction design and framework. There is, as I said, a huge amount of risk, and it does need to be worked out before you start. Does that get you there?
Yes, thank you very much. And we also really appreciate the World Bank's commitment to the green transition in Turkey. Not only wind, but also the infrastructure, like transmission as well. Yeah. So my next question, yesterday we had a sectoral gathering with the Minister of Energy in the morning. And I had 3 points in that meeting that I have included for offshore wind. And the most important one is actually the port infrastructure. So at the moment, we are planning a tender. Yes, we have a mechanism. But from the Minister of Energy's perspective, the ports are not considered. They just expect the developer or investor to deal with that and then have the marshalling ports and the ports that will be used for operation and maintenance will be, I don't know, there. But that's not the case for sure. So if we are thinking about building an offshore wind farm, we should also think about the investment, capital investment that will go into the port infrastructure, because the owners of those ports will for sure get it from the wind farm owners, investors. But from Jan Denu's perspective, what is your experience worldwide? How, I'm sure like this is not the only case in the world where the ports are not considered by the Minister of Energy. In such markets, how the investors are tackling this?
Again, a very good question and not really easy to answer, although I will try to make it as comprehensive as possible. Ports are the most fundamental part of the industry when you want to elaborate on offshore wind. Without ports, whether it be for installation or O&M, you will have very little chance of succeeding in a positive way to get to the ambitions that you have formulated. Now, I will make the difference between ports for installation purposes and O&M, because there is a difference in the mentality on how to approach it. But for the installation part, one should realize that the ports that are used for one project, say if the first project being a 1 gigawatt project in the Aegean Sea, that on the lifespan of that project, the use of the port on the installation part is only 2 years of the capex. it's nothing more. I mean, OPEX side is different, but on the CAPEX side, 2 years of that project is involved with the port infrastructure. Now, that being said, that is not a lot of time on the full lifetime of a project, and for ports to only be involved in projects that are using that for 2 years, it is almost impossible to ask from the port owners to make an investment in that if they don't have a return. So what I try to come to is that if it's 2 years for one project, the only moment that they will start looking at investing is when there is, like my colleague said, a pipeline. For one project, making a complete marshalling harbor outfit is too expensive. So pipeline is what it needs to be. How do we grow there? How do we get there? We have seen the example in Taiwan. We were one of the first movers in Taiwan, and we have there constructed 3 of the first projects where the situation was similar. There was no infrastructure present. There was little to no appetite to look at it, and there the government has played a big role by stating that for the first few years there was going to be some government involvement in trying to clear and create the right facilities, but that was, don't get me wrong, for smaller projects back in the day, 120 to 250 gigawatts. We are talking 1 megawatts. Now we're talking 1 gigawatt. So I think what the Turkish government should do is give 2 things. First, try to be involved by try to stimulate the local ports and giving them the confidence that the initial investment needs to be there in order to do the first projects. But to give that confidence to other investors, the pipeline needs to be there. And not only the pipeline, but also the promise to be kept. There's always a saying, for offshore wind, you better have a plan, but more important than having a plan is sticking to it. It gives the confidence for the supply chain, and it gives the confidence for also people who are looking at ports and terminals investment. Now, on the O&M side is a different story. There we are talking about a 25-year lifespan of an offshore wind farm, and the O&M starts from day one. So the outlook there is already 25 years, and there it is a lot easier for investments to be taken on a risk side, because they know that the outlook is there. And the only separate difference there is, for O&M purposes, the capabilities of the local ports need to be a little bit less extensive than for the installation side. And there is the last remark I want to make, and that is when we are talking about installation ports, the technical capability of what these key sites and what these port infrastructures needs to bear, it needs to be taken into account not only for the first projects but also later. Eric, you gave the perfect example, the size and the weight of your components. Back in the days, going from 60 to 600 tons, the capacity of the port needs to be able to bear that. And if you make an investment now for what back in the day was 60 tons of components, and you end up 15 years later with the requirement for 600 tons, then you have a problem. So think ahead, look ahead. There are plenty of people in the industry that are willing to think and have good ideas of where this market is going. For the turbines of my colleague over there, I think we've seen a tremendous growth from 6 megawatt to what I think Mingyang is now only looking at 21 and higher. If your ports are not capable of taking those turbines, we have a problem. So a visionary idea, the initial involvement of the government to give support, some financial confidence, and for the O&M side, I think it will be less of a problem, but it needs to be there, but only when the pipeline is guaranteed and when the government is willing to commit to sticking to the plan.
Your advice is really valuable, thank you. Eric, so we've been talking about ports, but Turkey is also has a challenge with the seabed. Like the Aegean Sea, for example, it's in the seismically active zone, plus the slopes are really steep. It gets from 10 meters to 50, 60 meters in few kilometers range. So it's challenging. For the foundation design, can you tell us about it? Like, which data needs to be collected, and how do you use that data to come up with a design, final design for the foundation?
I always forget this. The giant leap in the design of offshore wind farms I talked about is specifically concentrated in the design and the fabrication of monopile and transition piece foundations. Yeah. I'm in offshore wind since 2008, and my first project was Gemini in the Netherlands, 150 positions, 150 turbines of 4 megawatt. And then everybody said, 4 megawatt, that will be the workhorse of the North Sea. The only problem is we only have a limited amount of sites of less than 30 meters where we can install monopiles. That was in 2010, 2011. Yeah? Now we are installing monopiles with 15 megawatt turbines in 70 meters of water. Yeah? Now, there are a lot of conditions to be met before our designers, because we make our design, foundation design ourselves, before our foundation designers can come up with a good solution. And the information we need is twofold. First of all, we need very detailed information on the soil conditions and the mid-ocean conditions. Yeah? So a government who wants to increase the success of an auction can de-risk the project by gathering this information themselves. It will be a small investment compared to the total value of the wind farm, but it will de-risk, and if the government then opens this information to all the tenders, it will lower the tender cost for the whole value chain and increase the success of your auctions. So I would plea for very detailed surveys, geotechnical, geophysical, so that in the tender phase, it is very clear for every tenderer, for every developer who wants to participate in the tender, what the conditions, the soil conditions are in that particular place. Same for the mid-ocean conditions. There are LIDAR providers that are survey systems, which survey buoy, which you can put in the sea for 1 year, and during that time, this device will collect all the information needed. Once again, if the government supports that and opens the information to the developers, that will be a fantastic support, a fantastic incentive for more developers to participate in the auction. Now, foundation design, foundation fabrication, two components. There is the soil, but there's also the turbine. Yeah? And the combination of the loads coming from the turbine and the soil condition, the combination of that allows for a designer and a fabricator like us to come up with the most effective foundation design and fabrication. And also there, it is important that we have the collaboration of this important component, the turbine. To give you an idea, as a as a foundation designer, we use between 15,000 and 20,000 load cases to calculate the design, the proper design for a monopile and a transition piece foundation. roughly 20,000 load cases. You put them in a computer, it takes 3 weeks' time, and then the computer will say, okay, this is your most efficient design. Now, it is very important that the OEMs share this information. Yeah? Not 5,000 load cases, not 7,000 load cases, but we need 20 to 25,000 load cases in order to prepare an efficient design so that we can, fabricate a cost-efficient foundation. In the beginning, and I'm not talking about 2010, so some OEMs kept that information for themselves. They gave some generic load cases, 5,000, 7,000, and then we, as a designer, we had to over-design the foundations. Yeah? At that time, okay, whether it was 60 tons or 65 tons, doesn't matter. But now we are talking monopile, 2,200, transition piece, 650. So we are almost at 3,000 tons of foundations. There, every ton which is over-designed has no value anymore. Yeah? So it is very important for the developers, maybe there are developers here in the room, that when they are talking to OEMs, to turbine suppliers, that they ask in their tenders that the supplier, the turbine supplier, shares this information. And we know that some OEMs don't like to do that because they think it's competitive. They think, that it's a secret. They only want to keep it for themselves. Well, don't engage with those people because they will, at the end of the day, cost you a lot of money. Or maybe it is the strategy of those turbine suppliers to bring their own foundations from foreign countries. And then we are back to the first question. What has the local community as a profit from all this money that will be spent on offshore? So, you see, I come back to what I said in the beginning. Offshore wind is an ecosystem. It's localized. It's connected. It's not fragmented. It's connected. It's a community. And that is the advice I want to give to Turkey based on our European operations. Smulders has 15 yards all around Europe. We are working in 7 countries. And in all these 7 countries, we try to create a local ecosystem connected to each other, connected with the environment, with the politicians, with the politics, with the community. It all fits together.
Thanks a lot. So I want to discuss something futuristic with Horatio because my biggest worry for our industry, not only for offshore but onshore as well, are we going to be price competitive? If you think about solar photovoltaic and battery storage, because we see that on the east, the cost of wind is lowering every year. Like we see that the industry is trying to compete with solar. But on the west, we lack that. We don't see the drive and the cost, downward drive on the cost of wind as much as we like to. And if we think about offshore wind, so for onshore wind in Turkey, our LCOE is in the range of 30 to 40 euros already, which is very close to still large-scale solar photovoltaics. But for offshore, in Turkey, we are thinking about 80 to 90 euros for sites in the Aegean Sea. And the tenders, and recent tenders in Europe also shows us like it's not going under 60 euros. So what do you think about the future of offshore wind? Is it going to be price competitive like in the next 10 years? Are we gonna survive?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's a good question, and the answer is not so easy, but I try to answer it. So what is the difference between offshore wind, onshore wind and solar, in terms of pricing? I think cost is one thing, but it is not the decisive factor at the end of the day, because at the end of the day, you need to supply the consumption which needs to be covered out of your renewable energy and conventional energy production portfolio, right, from a national perspective. And the consumption is 24 hours, 7 days a week, with some maybe tops and tails, but it is definitely not like a solar profile where you only consume from 8 o'clock in the morning until 6:30 in the evening. So there are times in the 24 hours where you need electricity production. So, and if you take that into account, then you are not talking about costs per kilowatt hour for production. You're talking about capture pricing. Yeah? Capture prices is a value of your production profile out of your asset. Yeah? And the capture price from a solar production and the capture price from an offshore wind production, there's a huge difference. Yeah? Because offshore is producing at the weekend, in the night, when the sun is not shining, so and much more hours in the year compared to solar. Yeah? So solar, you have a production capacity of around, I would say, 1900 hours a year. In an offshore wind park in Europe, for example, in the North Sea, that can go up to 4,600, 700 hours a year. And if you look at Turkey, you are between, I would say, 3,500, 3,700 hours a year. So the quality of the profile of offshore is much better than from solar. So you can compensate that in solar if you add storage, and that is actually your calculation, what you need to do, right? So that is one thing. The second thing is, if you look a little bit in the future and you look the developing of the market, you will see a quite of speedy investment into solar and into onshore, because it's simply easier, yeah, to build. Yeah, we just discussed all the kind of hurdles and homework what we still need to do when we want to develop offshore. But at the end, we have a high-quality product, I would say. In solar, it's a little bit easier, but that has, of course, an impact on the prices as well, not in the cost, but in the prices in the market. Yeah? So you have a power exchange in Istanbul, for example. You have an hourly matching of prices. You will see what is happening in the future when you bring in these solar profiles into the market. The prices are going down in that time when you produce solar. Yeah, you call it cannibalization effect. Yeah, so prices on long term going down for solar, and the second step for onshore as well. And then the quality of offshore, is very kind of clear, because offshore is producing exactly in that hours as well, where you do not have solar and onshore production. And that is, of course, defining the price for power in the market. So the value for offshore profile is higher. So, but on the other hand, of course, building offshore is more expensive. Yeah, you have higher capex costs, opex costs, OEM costs are higher. But on the other hand, the capacity factor compared to solar and onshore is higher in the future. And that is, and here project developer needs to make their own prediction in the future. And then you can come up with the answer, offshore makes sense to invest or not. Yeah, and that is actually the question. So, but we have a lot of learning curves from other regions. I think, as you said, we started with smaller production in Europe. Today, there's kind of a huge kind of learning curve what Turkey can use to come up with a master plan to develop the portfolio. But so for me, as an OEM, I sell offshore, onshore, and solar. But I'm a big fan of offshore, because offshore is a very stable energy production, electricity production, which is perfect for a volatile market environment.
Thanks a lot. Then my last question of the panel to Mark. Again, to the most important question, I think, of the day, the ports. We want to. So we've already discussed why it is important, but what is World Bank's and maybe your opinion on that? Because World Bank also likes to fund infrastructure investments. When you are considering to support the offshore wind in Turkey, because you've already done that, you even published a report, right? Like last year, I think it was published. Is there a plan to support the port infrastructure as well?
Correct. We published the offshore wind roadmap 2 years ago now, actually, almost at this conference almost. And as part of that roadmap, we did look at the port infrastructure in Turkey. And as Bart was saying, offshore wind for installation and marshalling and all the activities you need to do around that installation phase, it has some very specific requirements. And while Turkey has got some very good, capable ports in the northwest Aegean and other parts of the country, there's no port that's currently got all of the things that an offshore wind installation requires. So strong quaysides for loading, space to lay down all your turbine components. And often, these are big container ports or cargo ports that have already got a lot of activities in there. So you've kind of got all this competition. So then there will need to be work that's done to those ports in some way. Now that isn't going to get solved before Turkey runs its auction. No one's going to come and invest and start building now before the projects are ready. So there has to be a credible plan for how those ports are going to be made to be ready for offshore wind. Again, that will take time, but there needs to be at the start of the journey a plan for how that's going to happen. We've seen different approaches in different markets. In the most ideal scenario, the government just takes all the risk and says, we're going to just build the port out and take the problems away. And that's them backing their own pipeline, their own contribution and commitment to the industry. And we've seen that in a few countries. France, in the last few years, recently committed to, I think it was 500 million euros for the port of Brest, northwest of France, and another 340 million euros for 2 ports in the south, in the Mediterranean, for floating wind. And then I think just the other week we had Spain committing about 200 million euros for 6 ports for floating wind and fabrication. So again, those are state-owned ports where the government is committing money to build infrastructure and, importantly, an industrial hub. And this is a point I always talk about in Turkey is it's not just about Turkey, it's about the region and it's about international markets. Your country is already exporting goods and services to the offshore wind industry globally. Can it do more? Probably. But what could those services and goods be, and what could investment into your infrastructure here unlock in terms of manufacturing that could support other markets? So that then you're not building your pipeline based on just what your 5 gigawatt target is. It's about the other 100 gigawatts in the Mediterranean, the 300 gigawatts in the North Sea, or further afield. Turkey needs to be thinking broader than just its home market. Otherwise, there isn't a case there to build a new factory just for 5 gigawatts. It has to think broader. So what can that investment be? And yes, if the government wants to take that proactive investment, either on its own for a state-owned port or alongside the private sector in a PPP arrangement, then certainly the World Bank would be interested in having that conversation, and that's something we've done in other markets too. We've seen in Scotland, in the Port of Ardisia, where we've got the private sector and the public sector working in that type of arrangement, with private sector putting in 300 million to build out a new port. It's an incredible facility that they built up there, and that's been supported by 100 million of public sector money as well to go alongside that. That's with the expectation that a very large pipeline of floating projects is going to come in Scotland. It's a long-term, very long-term infrastructure investment. That would have only happened with that government funding to basically try and reduce some of that risk for the private sector. So that's something, again, the government can help to incentivize to try and attract that investment. Another interesting case that's probably slightly more relevant is in the Philippines, where there's 90-odd projects that are being developed around the country. It's a very, very big archipelago of islands, and there's lots and lots of ports, but again, none of them are suitable for offshore wind. They've got quite tight timelines for developing wind, and the government has committed about 40 million, 2 phases of 40 million for one of the ports. It's not going to be a big infrastructure. It's going to be really targeted at what's needed for the projects in that region. So it's quite cheap, but they've had quite a close dialogue between the government and the developers for what exactly is needed. What's the minimum that's required? So it's a bit of a hybrid approach. They've taken a creative approach to making it work, given their timelines and resources. And they're building out a small type of port that could be used for marshalling. Again, I'd encourage the government to enter that dialogue once you have some projects that are progressing, how to structure that and how to make sure that what is being delivered for infrastructure and ports is going to be suitable for the market. The other thing the Philippines has done is think about, and I mentioned this before, timing of port and grid infrastructure, because this is also critical. These are huge investments into grid and ports that are required alongside the huge investment for offshore wind. The timing of that is critical for the timing of delivering an offshore wind project. If the government is asking a developer to commit to deliver an offshore wind project by a certain date, and they've got performance guarantees that are linked to that, but the ports aren't ready or the grid isn't ready, there has to be allowances for delays because we are working this industry out as we're going along in this case. And that's what the Philippines has done. It's thought about how do we prioritize certain projects for the ports that are available, but then how do we make allowances for delays in infrastructure or the availability of those ports, because there's a limited number, to make sure that the developers aren't going to be penalized and their performance bond taken away because they couldn't deliver on time because the port's not ready. And that's something that has to be thought through very carefully with investors very early on when you're setting out the framework for the tender and the future rules. Because again, if that risk is too high and there's a risk that you're going to lose your hundreds of millions of euros of performance bond because someone hasn't performed and it's outside of your control, you need to have that protection that you're not going to get penalized for that. But that comes to my point about having a clear and credible plan for how we're going to solve these problems.
Thank you very much. Because of the timing, I will not be able to take questions because my guests have to leave, I guess. You still want to add something, Bart?
I wanted to add one more thing, because it struck me when you told me after my second question that there was not a lot of good news, apparently. And you're probably right in the tenure that we were here in this discussion, but the questions were a little bit aimed at that as well. But we tried to give advice. But what I want to say, and as a closing remark, is we as Yandelow, we've been working in Turkey for several years, not in offshore energy, but also in the dredging departments. What we do know is that Turkey as a country has everything it takes to make things a success. You have the people, you have the education, you have the industry. But one good advice is use those resources that you have, but don't try to reinvent the hot water. We in Europe have made all the mistakes. We have learned from those mistakes. You are now at a point that you have everything you need, but please knock on our door. Come and ask for advice, and we will help you, because we want this whole industry, whether it be in Turkey, Far East, or Europe, to be a success.
Thank you very much, Bart. You helped me with the closing remarks as well. So thank you very much for listening to us today. Our panel is over. And thank you for the panelists as well.